New clean water regulations are raising questions about the future of hydropower in the state. Plus, a conservative PAC targets climate action in Vermont, and the town of Johnson and Vermont State University announce an innovative new partnership. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, September 5th. And with us on the panel today, we have Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, Calvin Cutler from WCAX, and Austyn Gaffney from VTDigger. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to dive into some really interesting things about the environment in this show today. Real deep dive here. And Kevin, I want to start with you. That big article in 7 Days that talks about sort of the tension, if you will, between clean energy production and clean water. And you've got some folks who are all trying to do the right thing on both sides of that equation, but they're not necessarily meshing. What, in a nutshell, was your article about with these things?
So we knew that there was a big report coming out, which we're going to talk about after this, I think, about the Green River Reservoir and its future. And what we wanted to do was set the stage for people so they understood how, in the state of Vermont, the hydroelectric energy that we generate from many, many rivers in the state is often something that regulators are not very fond of when it comes to the fish and the wildlife in those river systems. Regulators would really like many of those systems to be natural, not have dams on them, but these dams are important. They're important for generating electricity in the state. And so there's this tension, as you say, between those two public benefits. And there has been a very high profile example in the Green River Reservoir of how that tension between those two forces is playing out. And it's not going very well for the utility that owns that dam.
Where is the Green River Reservoir located?
So the Green River Reservoir is in Hyde Park. It was built in 1947 by the utility in Mooresville, and they built it in an effort to make sure they could hold back some water to release water downstream in the Lamoille River, where the dams might, like in the drought we're having now, they would try to release water from that dam so it flowed downstream to the other dams. Then in the 80s, they added hydropower to that dam. And so every few decades, the operators of such dams have to ask the federal government for permission to continue operating that facility. And so when they were running up to the relicensing of that dam, state regulators came in and said, well, we would like you to use less water from that dam when you generate electricity. The fish downstream, we don't want there to be too little water in the Green River below the dam for the fish. And we don't really want the level of the reservoir to be going up and down dramatically because that will impact campers, it'll impact all kinds of wildlife. And so they proposed a series of restrictions on the operations of that dam, which the utility said, whoa, what are you talking about? How are we supposed to run a hydro facility if you're not going to let us use enough water to do that? We've got turbines, they're in place, they have pipes that come down into the system, and it's all kind of set up for us to use in a certain way. We can't just use a third of that water and generate sufficient electricity. So they started this very public and years-long, what would you call it, Calvin? Sort of a dance about what's going to happen next.
Well, a legal battle, right?
And a legal battle, exactly.
Yep. I believe went all the way to Vermont Superior Court, Supreme Court, right?
It did.
Yeah.
So they've been fighting about this dam for years, and what we wanted to do was just back up a little bit and say, well, if this is such a huge issue for Green River, it's got to be an issue for other dams. And so that's part of what the reporting was about, was let's just see if other hydroelectric facilities in the state of Vermont are experiencing similar regulatory pressures, and it turns out they are. Turns out if you talk to Green Mountain Power, you talk to Washington Electric Co-op, and others in the state, they'll say, yeah, like we have been asked by our regulators to use less water in our hydro facility, and that starts to become a broader problem for the state because we have very aggressive clean energy goals, and we've just upped them a couple of years ago in the legislature, and now we've got regulators who are saying, well, we don't want you to generate as much power from those hydro facilities. Well, that's 57% of the power generated in the state of Vermont.
Wow.
So, like, if you start turning off the tap to the hydro plants in the state of Vermont, you have a real problem for the state's energy portfolio.
So as you mentioned, they have to, every few years, go to the federal government, say, can we keep operating here? But the utility that owns the dam is now saying, we're done, right? We don't want to do it anymore.
We can't, because we've asked you time and time again to loosen the regulations, to let us run it in a more reasonable way, give us more water in the winter, give us because they've dramatically restricted the amount of water that the utility can run through the dam in the winter. And I think for years and decades, really, people have been like, well, what's the big deal? It's winter, it's up in the middle of nowhere, there's no campers, there's no kayakers, there's no stand-up paddle boarders. But there are animals, there are wildlife, there are
loons,
there's all kinds of, so there is still an impact, and that's what some environmental groups were able to make, and regulators were able to make a really strong point about, and so that's what has basically caused this whole conundrum.
And so here we are. So Morrisville Water and Light says this is a losing proposition. They can't operate it. It's falling on their ratepayers. And they're urging the state, saying, state legislature and Scott administration, the state needs to take ownership of this dam. Right. That's the only way that they can operate it, to make money, to basically have it be sustainable. And you have the Scott administration that's saying, we don't want to get into the business of operating another dam. Right. It would be one of the largest and most complex dams to run. And so there's that side of it. The governor this week said that, really, they're not interested in that right now. But on the flip side of the coin, so what's the other option? There was a report that said that the dam is in good physical structural shape. Right. But the option that I think a lot of people say should not be on the table and really isn't, but would involve draining the reservoir and decommissioning the dam, which that's the end of Green River Reservoir State Park. And as we talked about, this is a huge driver for tourism, the economy, wildlife, canoeing. You go there during fall foliage season. Stunning. It's absolutely stunning. Really nothing like it in New England. So it's a real pickle that we find ourselves.
And there's really no chance, I think, that that's going to happen in the short term. So no one who's thinking about going to Green River Reservoir or camping there next summer, I think, should be worried that something's going to happen where the dam is going to be removed and the river. There is a profound public interest from the state of Vermont to keep the dam in place, keep the water levels where they are. People are paddling on canoes with all their camping gear off to an island on the other side of the reservoir. That all goes away if you drop the water level even about 3 feet. So it's just, you could adjust, I think, maybe a state park to a lower water level, but what a mess, right? Yeah. So nobody wants that to happen, and this report that Calvin was referencing that just came out last week was an effort to sort of lay out all the options for the state to prevent that from happening.
But if the governor, sorry to interrupt, Kevin, but if the governor doesn't want to have the state buy the dam and take it over, and all these different groups are vying for different things here, what is the solution? Does he want them all to get together and come up with a solution?
That's exactly what he said at the press conference yesterday, day before yesterday. He said, look, the only way that the best solution to this problem is for all the parties who have been involved in this fight over the last decade to come back to the table and figure out a solution that works for everything. And what was interesting, he said, what he wants is that solution to be that power is continued to be generated from that dam, which is directly in opposition to the report that basically said there's no real way you can run that dam profitably. Because one of the options was always, well, maybe the state will take it over and then they'll just find another dam operator who will lease it and they can run it and they can sell power to the grid and they can still make a go of it. And there was always this sense, oh, maybe they'll figure out a way to do that. This report was like, yeah, that's not going to work. It's a money loser no matter who's going to try to
Who's going to want to buy that?
Under the new water quality restrictions that the state has imposed on operations of that dam. So what I think Scott is hinting at here is, why doesn't everybody come back to the table and we'll see if these restrictions are actually necessary.
One more thing I want to point out before we move on to larger issues here, Kevin, is that, a lot of times I read these articles, I'm fascinated by the reporting you all do. The writing that you do needs to be acknowledged as well. And there's a line in here because you went and visited the Green Reservoir Dam and you went down to look at the structure and you write at one point, this is a tiny concrete structure with metal shutters at the back of the dam. It looks like the abandoned home of a deranged hobbit.
I did write that.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you. I really appreciate your writing on that. Austyn Gaffney, I want to turn to you now because, a lot of times during the summer, we have been talking about rain, flooding, and all the misery that can bring. We have an opposite problem now. We're in a serious drought. You talked with the state climatologist about this. What have you been hearing?
So since June, Vermont has been in a short drought, what the state climatologist called like a flash drought. So right now we are in a severe and a moderate drought, depending on what part of the state you're in, but the entire state itself is in a drought. But since last fall, we've actually been in a long-term drought. So we have like 2 different droughts going on right now and varying droughts going on in different regions. So it's a complex issue. But basically a drought comes largely from a lack of rainfall. So even if we got more rain, like we saw rain in Burlington last night, it's not enough rain to fix the drought. So the state climatologist told me that basically we would need, depending on where you are in the state, between 6 and 8 inches of rain over a month.
Wow.
Just to start to replenish what we've lost in the drought so far, because you need all that rain to kind of filter in through the soil and go into the groundwater. And right now we have a lot of thirsty plants, so a lot of that water is going to get sucked up by those plants as well.
And thirsty cows, too, as you point out in the article. What are some of the things that this is affecting here?
So it's largely affecting larger farms. So think like animal operations, like dairies. If you're a dairy who depends on feeding your cows from your own property, so from your grass or your corn, a lot of farmers said they aren't able to get a third cut of their hay, or they're not able to produce enough corn right now to feed all of their cattle. So they're having to go to kind of like third parties or to neighbors, and that can really cut into their profits. Farmers told me it can cost up to $100,000 just to get enough feed for their cattle for the rest of the season.
Wow, and that affects milk production too if the cows aren't getting enough water, right?
Yes, exactly. So one farmer I spoke to, he's had some of his wells not totally dry up, but dry up enough that he has to supplement with water from the creek nearby. So every day he goes once or twice a day to get up to 5,000 gallons of water from his creek. And he brings that in because, yes, if your cow isn't getting enough water, it's not going to be able to produce enough milk. You're not going to be able to sell enough milk.
Yeah, these are huge problems that we're dealing with, one extreme to the other, it seems, either too much rain, not enough. I want to talk also about an article that you wrote, Austyn, about the Koch brothers. And, a lot of people may be familiar with these folks, conservative political network that they run, Americans for Prosperity. They have been for years now trying to fight back against climate change efforts, mitigation efforts, mostly in red states, but now they're moving into blue states. What can you tell us about what they're doing here in Vermont?
Yeah, so Americans for Prosperity was founded by the Koch brothers in 2004. They're a nationwide organization. They have a separate PAC called AFP Action that kind of like funds different politicians, but Americans for Prosperity, they call themselves a grassroots organization. So they're here to kind of like work with volunteers and try to influence policy. So in 2023, they founded a 50-state strategy. So it meant instead of just focusing on red states, they were going to focus on the nation as a whole. So they started to have a presence in traditionally more progressive states like California and Washington, and now also Vermont. So in 2024, they launched their first major campaign, where they spent tens of thousands of dollars on mailers to kind of push back against what was then known as the Affordable Heat Act.
Right. Calvin, you've been covering this as well. How aggressive are they getting now here in Vermont?
Very aggressive. It seems like no matter where I go online, whether on social media, Facebook, or the like, one of those mailers even came to my house in Burlington. And there is a very aggressive push, really harping on the pro-affordability agenda. Politically, in the last election in Vermont's State House, Republicans or Vermonters elected more Republicans per capita to Vermont State House and Senate seats than anywhere else in the country. And I think Americans for Prosperity and the folks behind it see that momentum, and they say this is a message that's resonating with Vermonters. So let's try to get more GOP candidates elected. Historically, over the last 10 plus years, the GOP in Vermont has really struggled with candidate recruitment. A lot of races, have gone unchallenged against Democrats. And so they're really trying to use this as an opportunity to try to get more Republicans elected and to try to, continue to wield their political power at the State House. It's worth noting Democrats, though, still have the majority in both the House and the Senate, but a majority in the Senate potentially. If John Rogers is reelected as lieutenant governor, he could cast a tie-breaking vote. Republicans, I believe, need just 2 or 3 more seats in the Senate to have a governing majority. You throw maybe if Phil Scott runs again. There's still a lot of questions about who's in, who's out, politically. But there's something really fascinating that's happening with Americans for Prosperity and the GOP, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest stories to watch heading into next year's elections.
Is their strategy working?
Yeah, it is, right? I mean, if you talk to any of the Democrats who lost their seats in the last election, they will definitely point to the work of this group as having attacked them in a very potent and effective way. Those mailers, I think, have been cited, and the criticism of the Clean Heat Standard and Affordable Heat Act and those things have been cited by many Democrats who lost their seats as sort of the weak spot, that they were a little exposed on that issue, and these guys capitalized on that particularly well.
And sorry, after you.
Well, I was going to say, I definitely think AFP capitalized on it, but I think they're still, they're spending tens of thousands of dollars here, but they have hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal as a national group. So I think what they've done so far in Vermont, even though it's been influential, it's still been quite small. And so I think what will be interesting is to see kind of how they push up that momentum, especially with the summer accountability campaign that they're launching.
Right.
And specifically, they haven't funded any politician in Vermont yet. That would have to come through their PAC. So right now they're really focused on policies, and they're really focused on energy policy, especially.
I want to follow up with that, Austyn, about you mentioned a gentleman in your article, Ross Connolly. He's sort of the face of this here in Vermont. Who is he? What is he doing?
So he's the Northeast Regional Director. He is a 34-year-old who's been with AFP for over a decade now, and he is based in Manchester, New Hampshire. So he is kind of leading the effort here in Vermont. I think you talked to him as well, Calvin. And so he is kind of working to organize here in Vermont, but he doesn't live in Vermont, and neither does anyone else who is organizing for Vermont in AFP, for AFP.
Yeah, go ahead, Calvin.
I will say also, after talking with several Republicans and people sort of that work in campaign finance and politics at the State House, they contend that this is really the GOP kind of giving Democrats a taste of their own medicine. Over the years, when we talked about the Clean Heat Standard, to be fair, there was also money that was coming in outside spending in favor of the Clean Heat Standard. But outside money isn't necessarily new to Vermont politics. It's just really interesting to see it, come in first off this early in the campaign cycle, but also coming in for Republicans in such a pretty strong way.
Yeah.
What I found fascinating, though, in your article, Austyn, was that as you quote Ross Connolly here, and this is to Calvin's point, this affordability question, you were saying this too, Kevin, they're really hammering home Vermonters, you're getting hit in your pocketbook with things like the Clean Heat Standard, it's just going to raise your energy rates, et cetera, et cetera. Connolly is quoted in your article as saying, we're not denying climate change exists. We're saying the way we're going about it in the state is hurting people, and we should put people first and solve the problem in a more reasonable and moderate way. Does he say what that more reasonable and moderate way is?
I'd be really interested in hearing your perspective on this too, Calvin, but I think his argument is a very, what I say in the story is a very made for Vermont approach. For decades, AFP has been denying the science behind climate change. And in Vermont, they're saying, no, we're not saying climate change doesn't exist. We're just saying what you're doing will not solve climate change in Vermont. Instead, it's just hurting Vermonters. I think a lot of people who are on the other side of that argument would say the money that Vermont is going to save in the long term is going to help Vermonters by transitioning to this rather inevitable clean energy future. But folks like Connolly are saying this in the short term is hurting Vermonters. I will say, though, things like the Clean Heat Standard that he points to, that was never actually implemented. So it's never actually been able to hurt a Vermonter's pocketbook.
Yeah, that's took the words right out of my mouth. I think, the big two things that Americans for Prosperity is looking at. Number one, they haven't actually made any solid policy recommendations, to be clear. But yeah, removing the private right of action from the Global Warming Solutions Act, something that Governor Phil Scott has advocated for. That effort fell short this year. We'll see next year. But then also they talk about land use and regulations. And of course that in Vermont, meaning Act 250, maybe more exemptions, changes to that. that they say potentially could help build more housing and help our affordability challenges. So that's kind of reading between the lines of where policy-wise Americans for Prosperity is heading and what they're sort of throwing their weight behind. But yeah, we'll have to see exactly what actual policies they are supporting.
And one more question about the affordability argument here. If Ross Connolly is talking about things being more affordable for Vermonters, the federal government just cut $62.5 million that was going to be funding for Vermont solar projects, which, Austyn, was supposed to be helping low-income people especially, right?
Yeah, it's part of a $7 billion national fund through the Inflation Reduction Act, and much of that was cut by the federal government in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And so Vermont lost $62.5 million that it was promised through that program. And Connolly said, we don't agree with subsidized energy, whether that's natural gas or nuclear or solar. And so he said, we agree with the loss of this program through the bill.
They even celebrated the loss of it, according to your article, right?
The national group did.
The national group did.
The national group celebrated the passage of the bill.
Okay. I want to get to a more local story here, Kevin, that you were reporting on. The Burlington Electric Department is going to undergo an audit ordered by the Public Utility Commission. What's happening there?
Well, the Public Utility Commission made an extraordinary public filing not that long ago, about a month or so ago, wherein they laid out about 11 different shortcomings that they cited for the Electric Department of Burlington. And in fact, the phrase they used was troubling pattern of regulatory errors, inconsistencies, and shortfalls. So you never want your regulator to be out there telling the world that this is what they think of your management performance. And so what they asked is very unusual. I mean, regulators normally work behind the scenes and they have conversations with the entities that they regulate, and they say, look, this is how you need to do it. And apparently they've had some of those conversations with BED, Burlington Electric officials in the past, and the message didn't get through, I guess. And so they decided to make a much more public statement about their dissatisfaction with the way the utility is operating. And they asked the Department of Public Service what they thought they should do under these circumstances. And the other day, the department said, well, if it was up to us, what we think you should do is we think you should hire an outside management consulting firm to come in and comb through all the ways that this organization is not performing to your satisfaction. And they made pains to say there's great things about BED. It operates well. Outages are very rare. Customers are very happy. Well, the rates are actually reasonable in Burlington compared to some other more rural utilities where like crews have to go out to restore power over snowy mountainsides and everything. Burlington has a very compact service area, and so rates are reasonably low. But apparently on the regulatory side, they're just really dropping the ball.
What does that mean specifically? I guess we'll find out with the audit if it happens.
Yeah,
right?
We're going to have to wait for the auditors to get in there and root around. They did have several examples that they cited that were problems. One of them was one that we reported on, which was about $1 million that the utility lost out on by, it's kind of complicated, but they basically failed to accurately document the fact that they generate renewable energy. When you document that you make renewable energy, you can then go and sell that credit to someone else who really wants to say that they generate renewable energy or use renewable energy. That's a profit center for Burlington, and they flubbed it. They missed a deadline, and so they lost out, and their partners lost out on that money too. That was kind of a high-profile example of a screw-up. I think the regulator saw that. I think it came at the tail end of a bunch of other screw-ups that were more minor and not as newsworthy, and they said, that's it. We got to get somebody in there to figure out what's going on.
And as you say, this is pretty unusual for this kind of thing to happen publicly anyway. I want to move on to, I think, what sounds like a potentially really nice story here, and Calvin, you've reported on this. Vermont State University is teaming up with the town of Johnson for a service partnership. What kind of things are they going to share here? Yeah,
I mean, Johnson still is in the thick of flood recovery, as are many communities. And just up the hill in Johnson, there's a Johnson State University, or it used to be, now it's part of Vermont State University. Right. About a third of buildings on campus are empty because of declining enrollment, but also just switching majors and programs around. And so there's this new partnership that's developing between VTSU and the town of Johnson to relocate the health clinic, some municipal offices, the post office, up the hill to Johnson, getting out of the floodplain, restoring areas in the downtown to try to let more water flow. is the ultimate goal, but try to also bring more people up the hill to spend time at the college. So there's really this partnership that's being formed between the two, and they're really seeing this as a model that other communities in Vermont or even college towns across the U.S. that have been dealing with declining post-secondary education enrollment over the last 10, 20 years, they see this as a formula that other states might be able to look to. So we're still quite a ways out from this going. There's going to be some public hearings on it, public information sessions, but it's one piece of the Johnson flood recovery mosaic that I think there's a lot of people in town that are pretty excited for it.
Yeah, and Johnson is certainly making a name for itself. They physically moved their library. That was really an incredible thing that we saw in this program. We saw some video of that, so they're taking steps now. Again, I think this partnership makes some sense because it can really help out both parties here in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's ultimately the goal here, right? It's to try to revitalize Johnson and sort of how can we think about living with the river and making our community more flood resilient. We know that a lot of our downtowns are built in the floodplain. We use water and channels for power, waste, all types of reasons. And so this is sort of the next iteration of, how can we utilize our assets up the hill and, try to revitalize town. So it's pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah, appreciate the update on that. One last thing before we go. Our colleague and friend Kevin McCallum here works for 7 Days, of course, and the independent weekly newspaper is turning 30 they have 33 decades of reporting here in Vermont. So we did want to acknowledge that. And congratulations, Kevin, for being a part of that team at 7 Days. And that's going to have to do it for Vermont this week. I want to thank our panel, Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, Calvin Cutler from WCAX, and Austyn Gaffney from VTDigger. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. I hope you'll join us again next week as well for Vermont This Week. In the meantime, have a great week.